Sometimes the most defenseless among us carry the heaviest burdens. Every person deserves someone willing to stand between them and the darkness. In the harsh northern lands, Astrid was just a young bondswoman gathering kindling when two outlaws cornered her in the fading light. She had no family, no protector, and no hope of escape. The men thought they had found easy prey, but they hadn't seen Brandr Stonehide watching from the shadows. This massive freed thrall bore the scars of old chains and wore red war paint on his weathered face. When he stepped from the tree line, the ground trembled beneath his feet. What happened next was swift and brutal. Two outlaws lay broken, one crawled away, and Astrid found herself carried to safety in arms that had known both bondage and freedom. But what drives a man who has suffered to protect a stranger from the same fate? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The longhouse of Jarl Eriksson stood against the amber sky like a fortress of weathered timber and iron will. Smoke curled from its peaked roof into the crisp evening air, carrying the scent of roasted meat and burning oak through the settlement. This was Ironhold, a prosperous stead nestled between rolling hills and the edge of the great forest, where 40 souls lived under the Jarl's protection and rule. Astrid moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her worn leather shoes silent against the packed earth floor. At 19, she had spent the last 7 years in service here, ever since raiders had burned her village and left her an orphan with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her auburn hair, braided simply and pinned with a wooden comb, caught the firelight as she bent over the massive iron cauldron that dominated the hearth. The kitchen was her domain, though she owned none of it. Clay vessels lined the rough-hewn shelves, filled with dried herbs, salted fish, and precious spices that had traveled from distant lands. The wooden table bore the marks of countless meals prepared, its surface worn smooth by years of kneading bread and chopping vegetables. Here she had learned to turn simple ingredients into feasts that pleased even the Jarl's most honored guests. More wood for the fire. "Girl," called Ingrid, the head cook, a stout woman whose grey braids swayed as she stirred the evening stew. "The Jarl expects his supper hot, and the nights grow cold." Astrid nodded, wiping her hands on her woolen apron. She had been born into a family of modest farmers, but fate had made her a bondswoman, not quite a slave, yet not free to leave. Her debt was to the Jarl who had taken her in, fed her, and given her purpose when the world had stripped everything else away. In 7 years, she had earned his trust and the respect of the household. Though she knew her place remained precarious, the kindling shed stood 20 paces from the main hall. Near the edge of the settlement where the forest began, Astrid had made this journey countless times, but tonight felt different. The autumn air carried an edge of winter's approach, and shadows seemed to stretch longer between the buildings. She pulled her woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the gathering dusk. From the tree line, unseen eyes watched her progress. Brandr Stonehide had been watching the settlement for 3 days now, though none knew of his presence. He moved through the forest like a spirit, his massive frame somehow silent despite weighing more than 2 normal men. At 35, he bore the accumulated scars of a hard life, the pale marks of old shackles around his wrists, a jagged line across his left shoulder from a spear thrust, and smaller cuts that told stories of survival in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. His face was a map of endurance, carved in weathered flesh. High cheekbones spoke of northern bloodlines, while his grey eyes held the patient watchfulness of a man who had learned to see danger before it struck. Tonight, he had painted 3 red lines across each cheek in the old way, marking himself as a warrior seeking justice. The red ochre was mixed with bear fat and charcoal, a recipe taught to him by his grandfather before the slavers came. For 15 years, Brandr had belonged to others. Sold as a boy when his family could no longer feed him during a harsh winter, he had learned the weight of iron around his neck and the sting of the lash across his back. His strength had made him valuable in the quarries, the fields, and finally as a pit fighter in the arenas where men bet on blood and death for entertainment. But chains, no matter how strong, could not hold a man forever. 3 months ago, his master had made the mistake of leaving him unguarded during transport to a new owner. Brandr had waited for his moment, then struck with the patience and precision of a hunter. He had not killed needlessly, but he had ensured that those who bought and sold human flesh would think twice before doing so again. Now he was free, but freedom came with its own burdens. He carried no coin, owned no land, and had no family to return to. What he did have was a code learned in the hardest school imaginable, the belief that the strong must protect the weak, not prey upon them. It was a lesson written in his scars and tempered in the forge of his suffering. He had come to Ironhold following rumors of outlaws in the region, men who took what they wanted and left ruin in their wake. Brandr had encountered their handiwork twice already, burned farmsteads and families left with nothing but grief. He could have passed by, continued his journey north toward the mountains where a man could live free and alone. Instead, he had chosen to watch and wait. The settlement seemed peaceful enough. Jarl Eriksson was known as a fair man who protected his people and honored his debts. The longhouse hummed with the comfortable sounds of evening preparation, children's laughter, the clang of iron pots, and the low murmur of conversation. It reminded Brandr of his own childhood home, before the world had shown him its cruel face. As Astrid approached the kindling shed, 2 shapes detached themselves from the shadows between the outbuildings. Brandr's muscles tensed as he recognized the predatory way they moved, wolves stalking a deer. He had seen that walk before, in men who took pleasure in the fear of others. The first outlaw was tall and lean, with greasy hair tied back with leather cord. His hand rested casually on the pommel of a worn sword, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had crossed lines that most never approached. His companion was shorter but broader, with arms marked by crude tattoos and scars that spoke of many fights won through brutality rather than skill. They had been watching too, Brandr realized, studying the settlement's routines, learning when people moved alone and unprotected. They had chosen their moment and their target with the patience of experienced predators. Astrid sensed them before she saw them, that primitive warning that lives in the deepest part of the human mind. She turned to find her path blocked, her retreat cut off, and her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Well, what have we here?" the tall one said, his voice carrying the accent of the eastern fjords. "A pretty thing wandering all alone in the dark." "Please," Astrid said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I'm just gathering wood for the kitchen." The Jarl expects nothing!" the shorter man interrupted with a laugh that held no warmth. "Not from you, anyway. Come now, girl. We've been watching this place for days, and we know what you are. Just a bondswoman. No family to miss you, no husband to avenge you." They were right, and that truth cut deeper than any blade. Astrid had no protector, no champion who would demand justice for wrongs done to her. In the eyes of the law, she was barely more than property, valuable enough to care for, but not worth dying for. The tall outlaw stepped closer, and she could smell the sour ale on his breath, see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. This was not their first time, she realized with growing horror. They had done this before, to others like her, women with no voice, no power, no hope of rescue. "Scream, if you like," the shorter man said conversationally. "It's harvest festival. Everyone's deep in their cups by now. No one will hear you over the singing and drinking." They were wrong about that, though none of them knew it yet. From the forest's edge, Brandr had heard enough. He rose from his crouch with the fluid motion of a great cat, his massive frame emerging from the shadows like vengeance given form. The broken shackles that he wore around his neck as a reminder of his bondage clinked softly as he moved, the only sound that marked his approach. The first law of survival was simple: strike hard. Strike fast, and leave no room for mercy when protecting the innocent. Brandr had learned this lesson in Blood and Fire, and tonight he would teach it to others. The ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet as he stepped into the dying light. The tall outlaw's hand tightened on his sword hilt as he stepped closer to Astrid. "Now then, let's have a proper look at you." Astrid pressed her back against the rough timber of the kindling shed, her mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same dark conclusion. The settlement's evening sounds, laughter, conversation, the clink of ale cups, might as well have been a world away. Here, in the space between buildings where shadows gathered like hungry ravens, she was utterly alone. "Please," she whispered, hating the tremor in her voice. "I have work to finish." "The Jarl doesn't concern himself with the likes of you," the shorter man said, moving to block any escape route toward the main hall. "Everyone knows that. You're nothing but a kitchen wench with pretty hair." They were right, and that knowledge twisted in her stomach like a cold blade. 7 years of faithful service, of proving her worth through endless days of labor, meant nothing in this moment. She was property, and property could be taken. The tall outlaw reached for her arm with casual confidence, the gesture of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. His fingers were inches from her wrist when the night exploded into violence. Brandr struck like thunder given flesh and bone. His massive fist caught the tall outlaw in the temple with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil. The man's head snapped sideways with such force that Astrid heard his neck pop before he crumpled to the earth, his sword falling from nerveless fingers. The shorter outlaw spun toward this new threat, his own blade clearing its sheath in a practiced motion, but Brandr was already moving. The broken shackles around his neck caught the dying light as he closed the distance in 2 ground-eating strides. His left hand caught the outlaw's sword wrist in a grip that made bones creak, while his right drove forward in an uppercut that lifted the man clear off his feet. The outlaw hit the ground hard. Rolling and gasping, his sword lost somewhere in the darkness. He scrambled to his hands and knees, blood streaming from his nose, and looked up to see death standing over him. Brandr Stonehide was a mountain of a man, broad as an oak and nearly as tall. The red war paint on his face gleamed wet in the firelight, spilling from distant windows, transforming him into something from the old tales. A berserker, a force of nature, judgment wearing human skin. His grey eyes held no anger, no passion, only the cold certainty of a man who had decided another's fate. "Run," Brandr said, his voice like stones grinding together. "Run and tell your friends what happens to men who prey on the defenseless. Tell them Brandr Stonehide remembers their faces, and he will find them if they remain in these lands." The outlaw needed no second invitation. He scrambled to his feet and fled into the darkness, his footsteps fading quickly into the forest. The sound of his retreat was soon swallowed by the night, leaving only the normal sounds of the settlement and the harsh breathing of 3 survivors. Astrid stared at her rescuer, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The violence had lasted perhaps 10 heartbeats from beginning to end, but it had changed everything. The man standing before her was no ordinary traveler or farmer. His scars told stories of battles won and lost, of suffering endured and overcome. The broken shackles around his thick neck spoke of bondage survived and freedom earned through blood and will. "Are you hurt?" Brandr asked, his voice gentling as he turned toward her. The transformation was startling, from instrument of destruction to careful protector in the span of a breath. "No," Astrid managed, though her legs felt weak as water. "No, I'm unharmed." You saved me." Brandr knelt beside the unconscious outlaw, checking for breath and finding it, though shallow. "This one will wake with pain, but not death." The choice was his to make through his actions. He stood slowly, and Astrid saw how he favored his right leg slightly. An old injury, perhaps, or simply the weight of hard years. His massive frame blocked out half the sky, yet she felt no fear of him. Something in his manner, the careful way he moved around her, spoke of a man who understood the value of trust and the fragility of safety. "I am called Brandr," he said simply. "I have been watching this place." Watching? Why? The question came out before Astrid could stop it, though she immediately regretted the boldness. A bondswoman did not question her betters, especially not men who could kill with their bare hands. But Brandr showed no offense. If anything, he seemed pleased by her directness. Because wolves hunt where sheep graze. These men have struck before at farms and settlements to the south. They take what they want and leave ruin behind them. The unconscious outlaw groaned and stirred. Brandr looked down at him with the same expression a farmer might show a sick animal, regretful necessity rather than cruelty. This one must be brought before your Jarl. Justice delayed is justice denied, and his companion will bring others if left unchecked. Astrid nodded, though the prospect of explaining this to Jarl Eriksson made her stomach clench. How could she tell him that she had nearly been, that she had needed rescuing because she was too weak to protect herself? How could she admit that her very existence had brought danger to his household? The kindling, she said suddenly, seizing on the mundane task as an anchor in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. I was supposed to gather wood for the fire. Brandr's scarred face softened into something that might have been a smile, though it was difficult to tell in the uncertain light. Without a word, he moved to the woodpile and began selecting pieces of seasoned oak and birch, his massive hands handling the kindling with surprising gentleness. In moments, he had gathered an armload that would have taken Astrid 3 trips to carry. "Thank you," she said, as he offered the wood to her. Their fingers brushed as she accepted the burden, and she felt the roughness of old calluses, the warmth of living flesh that had known both bondage and freedom. "I don't know how to repay such a debt. No debt exists where justice is done," Brandr replied. "But this man must face judgment, and his friends must be warned away from these lands. Will your Jarl see reason, or must justice be found elsewhere?" The question hung between them like morning mist, heavy with implications. Astrid knew her master to be a fair man, one who protected his people and honored the old ways. But she also knew that the law could be a fickle thing, especially when it concerned the word of a bondswoman and a stranger against men who might have gold or connections to protect them. "Jarl Eriksson is just," she said finally, though uncertainty colored her voice. "He will listen to truth." Brandr nodded slowly, but his grey eyes held the patient wariness of a man who had learned not to trust in the justice of others. He had worn chains for 15 years after all. He knew how easily justice could be bought, sold, or simply ignored when convenient. The unconscious outlaw groaned again and rolled onto his side. Blood trickled from his mouth, staining his beard, but his breathing remained steady. Brandr hauled him upright with one hand, supporting his weight as easily as a man might lift a child. "Come," he said to Astrid. "Let us see what manner of justice lives in this place." Together, they walked toward the longhouse, where firelight danced behind oiled hide windows, and the sounds of evening celebration continued, unaware that the night had already shown its teeth. With each step, Astrid felt the weight of change settling around her like a heavy cloak. The simple routine of her life, kitchen work, obedience, and the small comforts of belonging had been shattered in moments of violence and rescue. Behind them, the second outlaw's sword lay forgotten in the dirt, its blade reflecting the last dying light of day. Tomorrow would bring questions that had no easy answers, but tonight, justice walked beside mercy toward an uncertain judgment. The great hall of Jarl Eriksson fell silent as Brandr stepped through the heavy oak doors, the unconscious outlaw draped over his shoulder like a sack of grain. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward the massive stranger whose red war paint gleamed in the firelight, whose broken shackles clinked softly with each measured step across the rush-strewn floor. Astrid followed close behind, the bundle of kindling still clutched in her arms like a shield. She had never entered the hall during the evening meal, never stood before her master's high table, where carved dragons gazed down from the support beams with eyes of polished amber. The warmth and light that had seemed so welcoming from outside now felt overwhelming. Pressing against her like a physical weight, Jarl Eriksson rose from his carved chair, his weathered hand resting on the pommel of his ancestral sword. At 53, he bore the scars of a warrior's life, a white line across his left cheek from a Saxon blade, fingers missing from his right hand where a berserker's axe had found its mark during his younger years of raiding. His grey beard was braided with silver rings that caught the firelight, and his blue eyes held the shrewd calculation of a man who had survived 3 decades of leadership through wit as much as strength. "Who disturbs our meal?" the Jarl asked, his voice carrying the authority of long command. "Speak your name and purpose, stranger." Brandr let the outlaw's body slide to the floor with deliberate ceremony, ensuring every person in the hall could see the man's bloodied face and torn clothes. The sound of flesh hitting wood echoed in the sudden silence, like a judgment pronounced. "I am called Brandr Stonehide," he said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "I bring you a wolf who thought to prey upon your flock." Murmurs rippled through the assembled household, warriors, farmers, craftsmen, and servants all craning their necks to see better. Astrid noticed how some of the men's hands had moved instinctively to their weapons, though none drew steel in their Jarl's presence. The hall suddenly felt smaller, charged with the tension that comes before storms. "This man attacked your bondswoman while she gathered kindling," Brandr continued, gesturing toward Astrid without taking his eyes from the Jarl. "His companion fled when justice found them, but carries word to their brothers that such deeds will not go unpunished in these lands." Jarl Ericsson's gaze shifted to Astrid, and she felt her cheeks burn under the scrutiny of the entire hall. To be noticed by her betters was dangerous at the best of times. To be the center of such attention felt like standing naked in a winter wind. "Girl," the Jarl said, not unkindly, but with the distant tone of a man addressing a useful tool. "Tell me what happened. Speak truth, for lies have a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times." Astrid's throat felt dry as bone, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "I went to gather wood as Ingrid commanded. 2 men cornered me by the shed. They meant harm." The words came out smaller than she intended, barely carrying across the hall despite the silence. "Harm." The Jarl's voice sharpened. "What manner of harm? Speak plainly, child." The heat in Astrid's cheeks deepened, but she lifted her chin with effort that cost her more than any physical labor. "They meant to use me against my will, my lord. They said no one would miss a bondswoman, that no one would seek justice for what they did." A dangerous quiet settled over the hall. These were hard people who lived hard lives, but they followed the old laws that protected the innocent and punished the wicked. Even a bondswoman deserved better than wolves in the night. "And this man," the Jarl gestured toward Brandr, "how comes he to be your champion?" "He was watching," Astrid said simply. "Watching over the settlement," he said. "He stopped them before they could." She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Every person in the hall understood what had nearly happened and what it would have meant. The Jarl's attention returned to Brandr, measuring him with eyes that had evaluated 1,000 men in peace and war. "You wear the paint of a warrior seeking justice, yet you bear the marks of slavery. Tell me your tale, Brandr Stonehide, for I would know what manner of man brings wolves to my table." Brandr reached up slowly and touched the broken shackles at his throat, the artifact that marked his transformation from property to protector. The metal links caught the firelight as his fingers traced their familiar weight. "For 15 years I belonged to others," he said, without shame or bitterness. "Sold as a boy, when my family could no longer feed me. I learned the weight of chains and the sting of the lash. I learned that the strong too often prey upon the weak simply because they can." The hall listened, with the rapt attention usually reserved for skalds telling the great tales. Slavery was a fact of their world, but rarely did they hear it spoken of so directly by one who had lived it. 3 months passed. I won my freedom through blood and will. I could have fled to distant lands, could have sought only my own comfort and safety. Instead, I chose to remain here, to watch for the wolves that hunt among the settlements. For I have learned that a man's worth is not measured by what he owns, but by whom he protects when protection is needed. The unconscious outlaw groaned and stirred, drawing every eye. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing pupils that struggled to focus in the firelight. When he saw where he was, surrounded by armed men in the heart of his enemy's power, fear replaced confusion in his features. "You," the Jarl said, addressing the outlaw with the same tone he might use for something unpleasant stuck to his boot. "What is your name?" The man tried to sit up, winced at the pain in his head, and settled for propping himself on one elbow. "Orm," he said reluctantly. "Orm Blacktooth. And your companion?" "The one who ran like a dog when faced with honest steel." Orm's eyes darted around the hall, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. Gunner One-Eye. Where do you come from, and who sent you to darken my lands?" The outlaw's silence stretched until it became answer enough. The Jarl's expression hardened like cooling iron, and Astrid saw why lesser men had learned to fear him despite his advancing years. "I see," Eriksson said quietly. "You think silence will save you. Let me explain why you are mistaken. You came to my lands uninvited. You threatened one under my protection. You brought violence to a place of peace. Even now, your companion spreads word that my people can be harmed without consequence. This cannot stand." The ancient drinking horn of carved walrus ivory sat on the high table beside the Jarl's cup, a relic of his grandfather's time that was used to formalize oaths and pronounce judgments. Its presence reminded everyone that justice in this hall followed the old ways, where right and wrong were settled by strength of arm and clarity of purpose. "Brandr Stonehide," the Jarl said formally, "you have brought justice to my hall. You have protected one of mine when I could not. Name your reward." Brandr stood motionless before the high table, considering the Jarl's offer of reward. The weight of 40 gazes pressed upon him, but his grey eyes remained fixed on Eriksson's weathered face. In the flickering firelight, the red war paint on his cheek seemed to pulse like a living thing, marking him as a man who had chosen justice over comfort. "I seek no reward for doing what honor demands," he said finally. "But I would ask for your ear regarding the threat these men represent." The Jarl's eyebrows rose slightly. Few men refused a Jarl's generosity, and fewer still did so in order to speak of duty rather than gold. "Speak, then. What threat do you see that my own scouts have missed?" From her place near the wall, Astrid watched this exchange with growing unease. She had expected swift judgment, perhaps harsh words for bringing trouble to the hall. Instead, she found herself witness to something far more complex, a dance of honor between two men who understood the weight of responsibility. "I have tracked this band for 10 days, Brandr said, his voice carrying the authority of hard experience. "They struck a farmstead south of here 5 nights past. A family of 7, murdered for a few silver coins and a horse. Before that, a merchant's wagon on the coast road. 3 dead, including a boy no older than 12 summers. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. These were not mere outlaws seeking easy plunder, but killers who left no witnesses behind. Such men were a plague upon the land, spreading fear and death wherever they wandered." "How many?" asked Thorvald, the Jarl's eldest son and heir, leaning forward in his chair. At 28 he bore his father's strong jaw and calculating eyes, though his beard was still more gold than grey. 8 in total, perhaps 9, Brandr replied. "They move in smaller groups to avoid attention, then gather when they've chosen their target. Gunnar One-Eye will reach them by dawn, and they will know that their presence here has been discovered." Jarl Eriksson reached for the ancient drinking horn, his scarred fingers tracing its carved surface. The ivory was yellowed with age and inscribed with runes that told of his family's victories in distant lands. When he lifted it, every person in the hall understood that formal judgment was about to be pronounced. "Orm Blacktooth," he said, his voice taking on the ritual cadence of the law speaker. "You have violated the peace of my lands and threatened one under my protection. By the old laws, your life is forfeit." The outlaw's face went pale as winter ice, but before he could speak, the Jarl continued, "However, I offer you a choice. Die here with what honor you can muster, or live as my voice carries word to your companions. Tell them that Jarl Eriksson remembers the old laws. Tell them that any who harm my people will face justice swift and certain. Tell them to take their wolves' work to other lands, for mine are protected." It was a calculated mercy, Astrid realized. A dead outlaw told no tales, but a living messenger could spread fear among his companions, fear that might drive them away without further bloodshed. Orm struggled to his knees, his head still ringing from Brandr's blow. "And I will carry your words, Lord." "I swear by nothing," the Jarl cut him off. "Words are wind. Actions alone have weight. You have until dawn to quit my lands. If the sun finds you still here, I will hunt you like the wolf you are." Two of the Jarl's men hauled Orm to his feet and guided him toward the door. His legs shook with each step, whether from injury or fear, Astrid couldn't tell. When the great doors closed behind him, the hall seemed to exhale collectively. "Now then," Eriksson said, setting the drinking horn aside and turning his attention back to Brandr. "You have given me warning and brought justice to my hall, but I would know more of your purpose here. What does a freed thrall seek in these northern lands?" Brandr's hand moved unconsciously to the broken shackles at his throat, a gesture Astrid was beginning to recognize as his way of anchoring himself to truth. "I seek no man's service and no lord's gold, but neither can I ignore the suffering of innocence when I have the strength to prevent it." "Noble words," Thorvald interjected, though not unkindly. "But winter comes, and noble words provide neither food nor shelter. What would you do when the snows arrive and the outlaws retreat to their holes to wait for spring?" The question hung in the warm air like morning mist, demanding an answer that would shape more than just one man's future. Astrid found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't say why the response mattered so much to her. "I had not thought beyond the present danger," Brandr admitted, with the honesty that seemed to define him. "Perhaps the mountains hold a place for one such as me. Perhaps the road calls again." "The road," Jarl Eriksson mused, stroking his braided beard. "Always the road for men who cannot find peace in one place. But tell me, Brandr Stonehide, what if peace found you first?" From the kitchen doorway, Ingrid caught Astrid's eye and gestured sharply. The evening meal had grown cold while justice played out its course, and there would be consequences if the Jarl's hunger went too long unsatisfied. Duty called, even in the midst of events that felt like legend unfolding. Astrid slipped quietly along the wall toward the kitchen, but not before she heard the Jarl's next words. "I offer you a place at my hearth, Brandr Stonehide, not as thrall or servant, but as a free man who has proven his worth. My lands need protection, and you have shown the will to provide it." The offer echoed in Astrid's mind as she hurried toward her mundane responsibilities. A place at the Jarl's hearth meant honor, security, and respect, everything that a freed slave could hope to achieve. Yet something in Brandr's manner suggested that accepting such generosity would cost him more than he was willing to pay. Behind her, she heard his deep voice responding, though the words were lost in the kitchen's bustle. Whatever his answer, she knew that this night had changed more than just her own fate. The simple world she had known, bounded by kitchen work and careful obedience, had expanded into something larger and more dangerous. In her apron pocket, her fingers found the small wooden comb that held her hair. It was the only thing she truly owned, carved by her father before the raiders came. Like Brandr's shackles, it was an artifact of a past that could never be reclaimed, yet somehow still defined the present. Dawn painted the eastern sky the color of old blood when Astrid found Brandr sitting alone by the dying embers of the settlement's central fire pit. He had not slept, she realized, noting the vigilant way his eyes scanned the tree line and the careful positioning of his massive frame that allowed quick movement in any direction. The red war paint had faded to rust-colored streaks on his weathered cheeks, making him look more human and somehow more dangerous at the same time. "You refused the Jarl's offer," she said quietly, settling onto the log bench across from him. It was not a question. News traveled fast in a settlement of 40 souls, and the kitchen servants had been full of whispered speculation about the strange warrior who had turned down honor and security. Brandr looked at her with those patient grey eyes, and she saw no regret in them. A man who accepts another's charity becomes bound by invisible chains stronger than iron. I have worn chains enough for one lifetime. The wisdom in those words unsettled her more than she cared to admit. For 7 years, she had found comfort in her bondage, taking pride in her skills and the small securities that came with faithful service. Yet here was a man who chose uncertainty over safety, principle over comfort. "But winter comes," she said, echoing Thorvald's words from the night before. "What will you do when the snows trap you in the wild lands? A man cannot eat honor or build shelter from good intentions." A smile ghosted across his scarred features, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. "You sound like my grandmother. She used to say that pride was poor seasoning for an empty pot." The mention of family touched something deep in Astrid's chest, a longing she had learned to keep buried beneath the demands of daily survival. "She sounds wise. What became of her?" The warmth faded from Brandr's face like mist before the sun. "Gone with the rest. Viva took her the winter before my family sold me to pay their debts. Perhaps it was mercy. She never had to see what became of me." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the last flames dance among the charcoal. Around them, the settlement was beginning its daily rhythm, the lowing of cattle, the ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith's forge, the cheerful calls of children playing in the yards. It was a peaceful sound, the kind that made a person believe the world could be good if given the chance. "There is something else," Astrid said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I overheard in the kitchen last night." Brandr's attention sharpened like a blade, finding its edge. "Speak." 2 of the farm boys came in late, saying they saw lights moving in the old stone circle 5 leagues north of here. "Not torches, something else. Something that flickered green and cold like marsh fire." The ancient stone circle was older than memory, erected by people whose names had been lost to time. Local wisdom said it was haunted by spirits who demanded tribute from travelers, but few took such tales seriously in the harsh light of day. At night, however, when the wind howled through the standing stones, even brave men found other routes to their destinations. "How many lights?" Brandr asked, his voice taking on the flat tone of a man evaluating threats. 7, they said. "Maybe 8, moving in patterns like men searching for something." Brandr stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding, like some great predator rising from rest. "The Outlaws. They seek a gathering place where they can plan their next move without fear of discovery." Astrid's blood chilled as the implications struck her. The stone circle commanded views of 3 major roads and offered concealment in its ancient shadows. From there, a band of killers could strike at any settlement within a day's ride and retreat before pursuit could be organized. "Will you warn the Jarl?" she asked. "What would be the point? He has offered me a place I cannot accept, and now I would burden him with knowledge of dangers I am not sworn to face. Better to handle this as a free man handles such things, directly." The casual way he spoke of confronting 8 armed killers alone made Astrid's stomach clench with sudden fear. This was not mere courage, but something bordering on madness, the kind of desperate valor that left men dead in distant places with no one to sing their deeds. "You cannot mean to face them alone," she said, rising to her feet as well. "They are killers, practiced in violence. You are strong, yes, but I am one man against many." He smiled again, though this time it held no warmth. "Child, I have been one man against many since I was 12 years old. The only difference now is that I choose my battles instead of having them chosen for me." From the blacksmith's forge came the sound of steel being shaped, the rhythmic hammering that spoke of weapons being made or mended. The smith, Gunther, was renowned throughout the region for the quality of his blades, and warriors traveled from distant lands to commission his work. In his forge hung a war hammer that had belonged to his grandfather, its head carved with runes of protection and its handle worn smooth by 3 generations of faithful hands. "I have an idea," Astrid said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. "But you must promise to hear me out before you speak." Brandr raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "You say you choose your battles now. Choose this one wisely. Do not go to the stone circle tonight. Wait until tomorrow, when the outlaws think themselves safe and settled. But do not go alone. You would have me gather an army to face 8 men." "That seems—" "No," she interrupted, her heart racing at her own audacity. "I would have you gather justice. Thorvald is young but skilled with sword and spear. Magnus, the blacksmith's son, dreams of proving himself in battle. Even old Eric the hunter knows every secret path through these lands." Brandr studied her face in the growing light, seeing something there that made him reconsider his dismissal. "You would have me lead other men into danger? Accept responsibility for their lives when I have sworn to serve no master?" "Not as their master," Astrid said urgently. "As their equal. As a free man among free men who choose to stand against darkness." The distinction mattered, she could see. It was the difference between chains freely chosen and chains imposed by necessity. The difference between leadership and servitude. From the hall came the sound of the great doors opening as the Jarl emerged for his morning inspection of the settlement. Soon the day's decisions would need to be made and paths chosen that could not be walked back. The council that gathered in Gunther's forge that afternoon bore little resemblance to the formal assemblies held in the Jarl's hall. 5 men sat on rough wooden stools around the anvil where countless blades had been borne, their faces lit by the red glow of banked coals. The air tasted of iron and determination, seasoned with the honest sweat of men who worked with their hands. Brandr had agreed to Astrid's proposal with reluctant wisdom, understanding that his pride was less important than the lives that hung in the balance. She stood near the doorway, officially invisible as befitted her station. Yet everyone present knew her words had shaped this gathering. Thorvald, the Jarl's son, examined the war spear in his hands with the careful attention of a man who understood that weapons were more than mere tools. They were extensions of will and purpose. 8 men, you say? Well-armed and experienced in killing. From what I've seen of their work, Brandr confirmed, they strike hard and fast, then vanish before organized resistance can form. But they're used to facing farmers and merchants, not warriors prepared for battle. Magnus, Gunther's eldest son, possessed his father's broad shoulders and steady hands. At 25, he had the strength to wield the forge hammer for hours without tiring, and the patience to shape metal until it achieved perfection. The stone circle offers good sight lines, but poor escape routes if pressed. They'll see us coming, but they won't easily flee. Old Eric the hunter nodded his grizzled head. He had spent 40 years tracking deer and wolf through every dale and forest in the region, learning the secret paths that connected distant places. His knowledge of the land was worth more than gold to men planning a night assault. "There's a ravine on the north side," Eric said, his weathered fingers tracing patterns on the anvil's surface. Steep sides thick with thornbush. A man could crawl close enough to count their teeth before they spotted him. Gunther himself, though nearing 50, still possessed the iron-corded strength that came from decades of hammerwork. His hands bore the scars of countless small burns and cuts, testament to a lifetime spent shaping raw metal into tools of war and peace. Around his neck hung a silver amulet inscribed with protective runes, a gift from his late wife that had kept him safe through many dangers. "The question," Gunther said thoughtfully, "is whether we seek to capture or kill. Dead men tell no tales, but live ones might reveal who else shares their interests in our lands." Brandr's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the smith's words. "You think they serve another's purpose? That someone sends them to spread fear and chaos?" "I think," Thorvald said slowly, "that 8 men don't band together to rob farmers unless larger profits await. These lands border 3 jarldoms, and politics here have always been complicated." The implication hung heavy in the forge's warm air. If the Outlaws served a rival jarl seeking to weaken Ericsson's hold on the region, killing them would only invite larger troubles. But if they were merely thieves grown bold, swift death might end the threat before it spread. From the doorway, Astrid watched these deliberations with growing unease. These were good men, honorable men, but they spoke of violence with the casual ease of those accustomed to its use. The reality of what they planned, creeping through darkness. To kill or capture 8 desperate criminals seemed to fill the forge with shadows that had nothing to do with the failing light outside. "There's another consideration," she said quietly. drawing 5 pairs of eyes toward her. Gunner One Eye escaped last night. By now he's reached his companions and told them what happened here. They know we're aware of their presence. Brandr nodded grimly, which means they'll be watching for pursuit. They'll set guards, prepare ambushes, make our task twice as dangerous. Unless, Magnus suggested, hefting his father's warhammer to test its balance, we give them something else to worry about. The warhammer was a thing of beauty, despite its deadly purpose. 3 feet of oak handle wrapped in leather led to a steel head marked with protective runes. It had served 3 generations of the Smith's family, and its presence in Magnus's hands seemed to declare his readiness to add his own chapter to its bloody history. "What do you propose?" Thorvald asked. "We strike at dawn, not dusk. Let them spend the night watching shadows and jumping at every sound. When the sun rises and nothing happens, they'll think themselves safe. Men who feel secure grow careless." Eric stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Dawn means approaching across open ground in full light. Dangerous for us. Not if we're already in position," Brandr said, beginning to see the wisdom in Magnus's suggestion. "We move tonight before the moon rises. Use the darkness to get close, then wait for first light to attack." Gunther stood and moved to a wooden chest near the back of the forge. From it, he withdrew 5 mail shirts of his own making, not the fine armor worn by jarls and kings, but honest iron rings that would turn a blade or blunt an arrow's point. "If we do this thing, we do it properly. No man goes into battle wearing only hope and good intentions." The sight of the armor made the enterprise real in a way that words could not. These were no longer plans spoken around a warm fire, but preparations for war. Men would wear iron, carry steel, and seek to take lives before their own were taken. Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air seeping through the forge walls. Tomorrow would bring blood and pain, triumph or tragedy, but it would certainly bring change. The simple world of kitchen work and small securities was fading like morning mist, replaced by something larger and more dangerous. "I should return," she said softly. "Ingrid will wonder where I've gone." But as she turned toward the door, Brandr's voice stopped her. "Astrid!" She looked back to find him holding something in his massive hands, a small eating knife of the finest steel, its handle carved from antler and wrapped with leather cord. It was beautiful work, clearly crafted with care and skill. "Every person deserves the means to defend themselves," he said simply. "Take this, and pray you never need to use it." The knife's weight in her palm felt heavier than all the kindling she had ever carried. With its acceptance came the acknowledgement that her days of helpless dependence were ending, whether she willed it or not. The moon hung like a silver coin in the star-scattered sky when Astrid crept from the longhouse toward the agreed meeting place. Sleep had eluded her completely, driven away by images of blood and steel, of good men dying in the cold dawn light for the sake of justice. She told herself she was only bringing provisions, bread, dried meat and ale, to sustain the warriors through their long night of waiting. But deep in her heart she knew the truth. She could not bear to remain safe and useless while others risked everything. The 5 men were already armed and ready when she found them at the settlement's edge. Mail shirts clinked softly as they moved, and weapons gleamed dully in the moonlight. They looked like figures from the old stories, warriors setting out to face monsters in the dark places of the world. "You should not be here," Brandr said quietly, though his tone held more concern than anger. "This is not work for a bondswoman," Astrid finished, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Perhaps not. But I know these men better than you think. I've served at table when they came to treat with my jarl. I've heard their voices, seen their faces." Thorvald stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "What do you mean?" "Gunner One Eye," Astrid said, her heart hammering against her ribs as she spoke words that could not be unsaid. "I know him. He sat at our table 3 months past, claiming to be a messenger from Jarl Hakon of the eastern fjords." The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the distant call of a night owl and the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. Each man processed this revelation according to his nature. Thorvald's face darkened with political understanding. Magnus gripped his hammer until his knuckles went white, and old Eric spat into the dirt with the disgust of a man who had lived long enough to see every form of treachery. Jarl Hakon, Thorvald said slowly, has been pressing claims on our southern borders for 2 years. Father has resisted his demands for tribute, saying our lands were won by his grandfather's sword and would not be yielded to threats. Brandr's scarred features showed no surprise, only the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had proven correct. So these are not mere bandits seeking easy plunder. They are Hakon's wolves, sent to soften your father's resolve through fear and bloodshed. The political implications crashed over them like a cold wave. If Jarl Hakon was using outlaws to terrorize Ericsson's lands, it meant the situation was far more dangerous than simple banditry. It meant potential war between the jarldoms, with all the death and suffering that would bring to innocent folk caught between ambitious lords. "There's more," Astrid continued, though each word felt like swallowing broken glass. When Gunnar visited, he spent long hours studying our defenses, asking questions about patrol routes and the number of warriors in our service. I thought it was mere curiosity, but now we know he was mapping our weaknesses, Magnus finished grimly, planning the best ways to strike and where our responses would be. Weakest, Gunther's weathered hand moved unconsciously to the silver amulet at his throat, a gesture that spoke of a man seeking divine protection in the face of mortal danger. If Hakon seeks war through proxies, attacking his agents directly could provide the excuse he needs to move openly against us. And if we do nothing, Eric pointed out, his agents will continue their bloody work until fear breaks our people's spirit. Sometimes a man must choose between bad choices and worse ones. From beneath her cloak, Astrid withdrew something that made every man present draw a sharp breath. It was a leather scroll case, sealed with red wax, and marked with the raven sigil of Jarl Hakon. Her hands trembled as she held it, knowing that its contents could change everything. "I took this from Gunnar's saddlebags while he slept," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought it might be important, but I could not read the runes. I've carried it for 3 months, not knowing what to do." Thorvald reached for the case with hands that shook slightly. As the Jarl's son and heir, he had been taught to read the formal script used for important communications. The others gathered close as he broke the seal and unrolled the parchment, tilting it toward the moonlight. His face went pale as death as he read, and when he looked up, his eyes held a terrible knowledge. This is not just about raiding and terror. Hakon plans to claim these lands through marriage alliance, not conquest. He has proposed to wed his daughter to me, bringing our holdings together under his rule when father dies. The scroll detailed more than political maneuvering. It outlined a complete strategy for subjugating Ericsson's lands through a combination of internal pressure and external threat. The outlaw raids were meant to demonstrate the Jarl's inability to protect his people, weakening his authority and making Hakon's offer of protection through marriage seem reasonable. "Marriage or conquest," Magnus said quietly. "Either way, our freedom dies." "Which explains why they want me alive," Thorvald continued, his voice bitter with understanding. "A dead heir cannot wed anyone, but a captured one can be coerced into accepting terms that serve Hakon's interests." Brandr took the scroll and studied its contents with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read between the lines of powerful men's words. "This changes our mission entirely. We cannot simply kill these agents. We need proof of Hakon's involvement to show to the other Jarls. Dead men cannot testify to their master's treachery." The silver amulet at Gunther's throat caught the moonlight as he shifted position. It was inscribed with protective runes that his wife had commissioned from a traveling priest years before her death, and he had worn it through every dangerous moment since. Now it seemed to pulse with its own light, as if the gods themselves were weighing the choices before them. "So we take prisoners," Magnus said, though his grip on the war hammer suggested he would prefer a simpler solution. "Force them to confess their true purpose." "Some of them," Brandr agreed, "but carefully. If word reaches Hakon that his scheme has been discovered, he might abandon subtlety and move to open war before we can prepare." Old Eric studied the distant tree line where the stone circle lay hidden in darkness. Dawn is still hours away. We have time to adjust our plans, but not to hesitate. Every moment we delay gives them more time to grow suspicious. Astrid found herself holding her breath as the 5 men weighed choices that would determine the fate of everyone she had ever known. The simple world of kitchen work and small securities had vanished completely now, replaced by a reality where politics and violence danced together like lovers in the night. "I'm coming with you," she said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. "Absolutely not," Brandr replied immediately. "This will be dangerous work, and I'm the only one here who can identify all of Hakon's agents by sight," she interrupted, finding strength she had never known she possessed. "You need me if you want to be certain you capture the right men and leave no witnesses to warn their master." The truth of her words settled over the group like morning frost. In her 3 months of carrying Gunnar's secret message, Astrid had transformed from innocent victim to crucial witness. Her knowledge could mean the difference between success and catastrophe, but accepting her help meant allowing a young woman to walk into mortal danger, and none of them could make that choice lightly. The approach to the stone circle required 2 hours of careful movement through terrain that seemed designed to betray unwary travelers. Ancient thorn bushes caught at clothing with grasping fingers. Hidden roots threatened to turn ankles, and loose stones clattered like warning bells at the slightest misstep. Yet the 6 figures moved through this obstacle course with the patient determination of people who understood that haste could mean death. Brandr led the way, his massive frame somehow finding passage where smaller men might have struggled. Behind him came Eric, the old hunter whose knowledge of every deer path and hidden ravine proved invaluable in the darkness. The others followed in careful single file, Thorvald with his spear held ready, Magnus bearing his grandfather's war hammer, Gunther with sword and shield, and finally Astrid, her eating knife a small comfort against the terrors of the night. The stone circle crowned a low hill that commanded views of the surrounding countryside for leagues in every direction. 7 standing stones, each taller than 2 men, and carved with spirals that predated written memory, formed a rough circle around a flat space where grass grew thin and sickly. Local legend claimed the stones had been raised to mark a battlefield where ancient kings had died, and that their spirits still walked on moonless nights. Tonight, however, the spirits would have to share their domain with more earthly dangers. As they crested the final ridge, the Outlaws' camp became visible in the hollow between the stones. 5 men sat around a small fire, their weapons stacked nearby but within easy reach. 2 others moved in slow circuits around the perimeter, guards who took their duty seriously despite the late hour. The 8th member of their band was nowhere to be seen, which meant either Gunnar One-Eye had not yet returned or was positioned as an outer sentry beyond their sight. Astrid studied the faces illuminated by firelight, her heart sinking as she recognized features that had once sat peacefully at her master's table. There was Sven the far-traveled, who had entertained the hall with tales of distant lands. Beside him sat Bjorn Irontooth, who had praised Ingrid's cooking and left silver for the kitchen servants. These were not the desperate brigands she had imagined, but men she had served food and ale to with her own hands. "I count 7. "Oh, plus the missing 8th, Brandr whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Can you identify them all?" Astrid nodded, though the gesture felt like betrayal. "The tall one by the fire is Sven. The broad one beside him is Bjorn, the guard walking toward the eastern. Stone is Ulf Redbeard, I remember, because he asked about my family when he thought no one was listening. Each name she spoke felt like a small death. These men had seemed kind in the warmth of the hall, but now she saw them for what they truly were, agents of a rival Jarl who had smiled while planning her people's destruction. The realization that evil could wear friendly faces was perhaps the hardest lesson of a night full of harsh truths. "Position matters more than numbers," Magnus whispered, adjusting his grip on the warhammer. "They're bunched together around the fire, perfect targets, if we can get close enough." "Too close together," Thorvald corrected quietly. If we strike at the fire, they'll rally quickly and fight as a unit. Better to separate them, draw them out where we can face smaller groups. Old Eric pointed toward a gap between two of the standing stones, where shadows gathered thick as black wool. If young Astrid could slip through there and make noise on the far side, it might draw some of them away from the main group. No, Brandr said immediately, his tone allowing no argument. She stays with us where she can be protected. We don't risk the one person who can identify Hakon's agents for certain. From her belt, Astrid drew the eating knife Brandr had given her, its blade catching starlight like captured moonbeams. The weapon felt heavier than seemed possible for its size, weighted with the responsibility of violence and the knowledge that before dawn she might be called upon to use it. "I'm not helpless," she said quietly but firmly. "And if we're to do this thing, we need every advantage we can gain." The debate was interrupted by movement from the camp below. One of the guards was approaching their hiding spot, his path taking him directly toward the ravine where they lay concealed. In moments, he would be close enough to see them, close enough to raise the alarm that would bring 7 armed killers down upon them. Brandr moved with the fluid silence of a hunting cat. One moment he was beside Astrid in the concealing darkness, the next he had flowed forward like living shadow to intercept the guard. The man, Astrid recognized him as Harold the Swift, another of Hakon's false messengers, had time for one startled intake of breath before Brandr's massive hands closed around his throat. The struggle lasted perhaps 10 heartbeats, Harold's feet drumming briefly against the earth before going still. Brandr lowered the unconscious man gently to the ground, binding his hands with leather cord and stuffing a cloth gag into his mouth with practiced efficiency. "One down," he whispered as he returned to their position. 6 to go, plus whoever's watching from the outer perimeter. The captured guard's belt pouch yielded a small treasure, a second scroll bearing Hakon's raven seal. This one containing what appeared to be a detailed map of Ironhold's defenses and patrol schedules. Thorvald's face darkened as he studied the markings by starlight, realizing how thoroughly their enemies had prepared for the coming assault. "This shows every weak point in our walls," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Every time and place where our guards change shift. They've been watching us for months, which means they're ready to strike soon," Magnus added grimly. "Perhaps within days." The urgency of their situation crystallized around them like winter ice. This was no longer a simple matter of capturing bandits or even gathering evidence of Hakon's treachery. They were racing against time to prevent an attack that would come whether they succeeded or failed. From around Gunter's neck, the silver amulet caught the faint starlight as he shifted position. The protective runes inscribed on its surface seemed to pulse with their own inner light, as if the gods themselves were watching the unfolding drama with interest. His wife had given him that amulet on their wedding day, claiming it would keep him safe through any danger. Tonight, he prayed she had been right. "We need at least 2 prisoners alive," Brandr said, reviewing their options. "Preferably the leaders who would know the most about Hakon's plans. Sven the Far-Traveled and Bjorn Iron-Tooth," Astrid confirmed. "They spent the most time speaking privately with my Jarl during their visits. If anyone knows the full scope of the plot, it would be them." A new sound reached them from the camp below, the distinctive rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. Someone was riding hard toward the stone circle, and from the urgency of the pace, it carried news that could not wait for dawn. Gunnar One-Eye materialized from the darkness beyond the stones, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with purpose. He dismounted quickly and strode toward the fire where his companions waited. Even from their concealed position, the watchers could see the tension in his movements, the jerky gestures of a man bearing ill tidings. "Brothers," Gunnar called as he approached the fire, his voice carrying clearly through the still night air. "The plan has changed. We strike tomorrow at dawn, not 3 days hence as originally planned." The men around the fire rose to their feet, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Whatever news Gunnar carried, it was significant enough to accelerate their timeline dramatically. "What's happened?" Sven asked, his previously jovial demeanor replaced by the cold calculation of a professional killer. The giant thrall I told you about. He's more dangerous than we thought. He's gathering men, asking questions, stirring up the settlement against us. Your Hakon's orders were clear. If our presence is discovered, we move to the final phase immediately. The final phase. The words sent ice through Astrid's veins as she realized that tomorrow would bring more than simple raiding. These men were preparing for something far worse, something that would require immediate action to prevent. Around her, the 5 warriors of Ironhold exchanged glances full of grim understanding. The time for careful planning and cautious approach had passed. Dawn was perhaps 4 hours away, and when it came, it would bring either salvation or catastrophe for everyone they had sworn to protect. The attack came with the first pale fingers of dawn creeping across the eastern horizon. When the Outlaws' fire had burned low and exhaustion weighed heavy on their shoulders, Brandr struck like winter lightning, sudden, devastating, and utterly without mercy. He emerged from the ravine in silence, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace of a predator born for violence. The broken shackles at his throat caught the dying firelight as he closed the distance to the nearest sentry in 3 ground-eating strides. Ulf Redbeard had time to open his mouth for a warning cry before Brandr's iron fist caught him in the temple, dropping him like a felled tree. The coordinated assault unfolded with deadly precision. Thorvald came from the eastern approach, his spear seeking the heart of Bjorn Irontooth before the man could reach his sword. Magnus charged from the south, his grandfather's warhammer whistling through the morning air toward Sven, the far-traveled skull. Old Eric materialized from behind the standing stones like a ghost given flesh, his hunting knife finding the ribs of the man called Crow. But battle rarely follows the plans of mortal men. Gunnar One-Eye proved why he had survived 15 years of violence and treachery. Even as his companions fell around him, he rolled away from Magnus's crushing blow and came up with steel in his hand. His blade met the warhammer's shaft with a ringing clash that sent sparks dancing through the dawn air. "Kill them all!" Gunnar roared, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Leave no witnesses." Sven, the far-traveled, proved equally quick to react. He ducked under Thorvald's spear thrust and grappled with the young heir, their struggle sending both men tumbling among the ancient stones. Thorvald's superior training warred against Sven's desperate fury as they rolled and struck at each other with knife and bare hands. From her position in the ravine, Astrid watched the battle unfold with her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had seen violence before, the inevitable result of too much ale and wounded pride during festival nights, but this was something altogether different. This was killing work, where men sought to end each other's lives with professional efficiency. Brandr found himself facing 3 opponents as the remaining outlaws rallied around their leader. His massive frame gave him reach and strength, but numbers told their own tale. Steel rang against steel as he parried, desperate strikes while seeking openings for his own. Attacks, a thrown knife she never saw who cast it, tumbled end over end through the pale. Morning light toward Thorvald's exposed back. Without conscious thought, Astrid found herself moving. The eating knife Brandr had given her flew from her hand with desperate accuracy, striking the thrown blade and sending it spinning harmlessly into the grass. Her intervention saved Thorvald's life, but exposed her position. One of the outlaws, a lean man with scars marking his face like ritual tattoos, turned toward her hiding place with murder in his eyes. "The girl," he snarled, advancing with his sword raised. "She's seen too much." Gunther the smith moved to intercept, his own blade meeting the outlaws in a shower of sparks. The silver amulet at his throat blazed with reflected firelight as the 2 men circled each other like wolves, seeking advantage. His enemy was younger and faster, but Gunther had 40 years of experience shaping iron and steel, muscles like iron cables, and the desperate strength of a man protecting the innocent. The tide of battle shifted moment by moment. Magnus's warhammer found its mark at last, sending one outlaw to join his ancestors with a sound like a melon dropped on stone. But Gunnar's blade opened a gash along the young smith's arm. Painting his mail shirt with crimson, Thorvald managed to pin Sven the far-travelled among the standing stones. His spear point pressed to the man's throat. "Yield!" he commanded. Yield and face justice like a man. But Sven's response was to spit in the heir's face and drive his hidden dagger toward Thorvald's unprotected side. Only a desperate twist saved the young man's life, though the blade still found flesh, drawing a line of fire across his ribs. Old Eric fought with the cunning of age against the strength of youth, his hunting knife weaving patterns that confused and frustrated his opponent. But a stumble over loose stone left him vulnerable for a heartbeat, long enough for a sword thrust that would have ended his long life had Brandr not arrived like an avalanche of fury. The giant's intervention scattered the remaining outlaws, like leaves before a storm wind. His massive hands caught one man's sword arm and simply snapped it like kindling. A backhand blow sent another spinning into the base of a standing stone with force enough to crack ribs. In moments, only Gunnar One-Eye remained standing, his blade weaving desperate patterns as he faced three opponents with dawn, painting the sky the color of fresh blood behind him. "Surrender," Brandr commanded, his voice carrying the finality of judgment pronounced. "Your men are dead or dying. You have nowhere to run." Gunnar's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Perhaps, but Jarl Hakon's plan doesn't die with me, giant. The attack comes regardless." Gunnar One-Eye's defiant words hung in the morning air like a curse as he raised his sword for one final desperate charge. Blood streamed from a dozen wounds. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his eyes still burned with the fierce will that had kept him alive through countless battles. "For Jarl Hakon," he roared, launching himself at Brandr with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Steel rang against steel as the two warriors met in the center of the stone circle. Gunnar was skilled, experienced, and fighting with the desperate strength of the doomed. But Brandr was a force of nature given human form, his massive frame moving with impossible grace as he turned aside every attack while pressing his own relentless assault. The end came suddenly. Gunnar's blade, notched from blocking the giant's crushing blows, finally shattered against Brandr's next strike. The outlaw leader stood for a moment holding nothing but a broken hilt, his face showing the stunned realization that death had finally found him. Brandr's massive fist took him in the chest with the force of a falling tree. Gunnar flew backward to crash against one of the standing stones, his body crumpling like a discarded puppet. When the echoes faded, only the sound of labored breathing and the distant call of mourning birds disturbed the ancient silence. "Is he dead?" Astrid asked, emerging from the ravine on trembling legs. The violence had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since the first blow was struck. Thorvald checked the fallen leader's pulse and nodded grimly. "Dead, but we still have prisoners." He gestured towards Sven the far-travelled, who sat propped against a stone with his hands bound and a gag in his mouth. 2 other outlaws had survived the battle, though both would need healing before they could be questioned properly. "The attack," Magnus said urgently, pressing a cloth to the wound on his arm. "Gunnar said it comes regardless of what happened here. We need to warn—" His words were cut off by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, many of them coming fast from the direction of Ironhold. Weapons rose instinctively before the riders crested the hill and proved to be Jarl Eriksson himself, leading 20 armed men on lathered horses. The Jarl's weathered face showed no surprise at finding his son and heir standing among the bodies of dead outlaws. His calculating eyes took in the scene with the swift assessment of a man who had survived 3 decades of leadership through understanding when to act and when to wait. "Father," Thorvald called, relief evident in his voice. "How did you know?" "Young Olaf came running to the hall an hour past dawn," Eriksson replied, dismounting with the careful movements of a man feeling his years. said he'd seen lights moving toward the stone circle in the night, and that our brave volunteers had vanished from their beds. I decided it was time to learn what manner of games were being played on my lands. Astrid watched as father and son embraced briefly, the formal reserve of their public roles giving way momentarily to genuine familial warmth. Then duty reasserted itself, and they became Jarl and heir once more. "We found these among the dead," Thorvald said, producing the scrolls that detailed Hakon's plot. Proof that these were no mere bandits, but agents of the eastern fjords sent to weaken our defenses. The Jarl studied the documents with growing anger, his scarred features darkening like a storm cloud. When he finished reading, he looked up with eyes that promised retribution for those who had dared threaten his people through treachery and lies. "Hakon seeks war through proxy," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made lesser men tremble. "He shall have war direct instead. But first, we must secure what evidence we can from these prisoners. From the captured supplies, they recovered more scrolls, silver bearing Hakon's mark, and detailed plans for a three-pronged assault that would have begun that very day. The attack would have come at dawn, with the main force striking the settlement's gates, while smaller groups seized the granaries and the Jarl's own hall. 40 men, Eriksson mused, studying the battle plans. Well-armed and mounted, moving under cover of these raids to position themselves for the final strike. Without your warning, they would have found us completely. Unprepared, Brandr knelt beside Gunnar's body and retrieved something from the dead man's belt. A bronze horn carved with the raven sigil of Jarl Hakon. It was meant to signal the attack when blown at the appointed time. Now it would serve a different purpose. "If this horn does not sound at the proper hour," he said, offering it to the Jarl, "Hakon's forces will know their advance guard has failed. They may retreat, or they may attack anyway out of desperation. Then we ensure it sounds," Eriksson decided. "But we choose what signal it carries. Magnus, how quickly can you reach our allies in the northern settlements? We'll need every man who can hold a spear if we're to meet Hakon's army with proper force." The silver amulet at Gunther's throat caught the morning sunlight as he stepped forward. "The message will go out within the hour, my lord. But will our neighbors answer the call in time?" "They will," the Jarl said with quiet certainty. "For Hakon threatens us all." 3 months after the battle at the Stone Circle, Astrid stood in the kitchen of Ironhold's longhouse, but everything had changed. Where once she had moved through her duties with the careful invisibility of the powerless, now she carried herself with the quiet confidence of one who had faced darkness and emerged stronger. The eating knife Brandr had given her still hung at her belt, not as a reminder of violence, but as a symbol of her transformation from helpless victim to woman of substance. The great hall buzzed with the sounds of the harvest feast, but this celebration carried deeper meaning than mere seasonal tradition. It marked 3 months of peace, following the defeat of Jarl Hakon's forces. 3 months of rebuilding and strengthening bonds between neighboring settlements, and 3 months of a new understanding between masters and those who served them. From the kitchen doorway, Astrid could see Brandr seated at the high table beside Jarl Eriksson, no longer an outsider seeking justice, but a trusted counselor whose wisdom had proven itself in blood and fire. The broken shackles still hung around his massive neck, but now they served as a reminder of freedom, chosen rather than slavery endured. His scarred hands gestured as he spoke quietly with the Jarl about matters of defense and justice, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience. The bronze signal horn that had once been meant to summon Hakon's attack now rested in a place of honor above the hearth, its raven sigil serving as a reminder that enemies could be turned to allies through courage and clever planning. On that desperate morning 3 months past, Brandr had blown the horn not to signal attack, but to call for parley, using Hakon's own battle plans against him. The confrontation that followed had been political rather than military. Faced with evidence of his treachery and the united opposition of 3 allied jarldoms, Håkon had been forced to choose between war he could not win and terms that preserved his honor while ending his ambitions. The settlement had been negotiated in the traditional way, with oaths sworn on sacred weapons and witnessed by men of standing. "The stew smells like heaven," a familiar voice said behind her. Astrid turned to find Thorvald approaching with a wooden bowl in his hands, his movements still slightly careful due to the scar along his ribs. As heir to the jarldom, he now bore new responsibilities that had aged him beyond his years, but his smile retained the warmth that had made him beloved among his people. "It should," Astrid replied, ladling the rich mixture of meat and vegetables into his bowl. "Ingrid says it's her grandmother's recipe, though she adds her own touches. And what touches do you add?" Thorvald asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I've noticed the meals have improved considerably since you began sharing kitchen duties with Ingrid." The question would have terrified her 3 months ago, but now Astrid met his gaze directly. "I remember my mother's way with herbs, and I've learned which combinations please different palates. A good cook pays attention to more than just recipes." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Magnus, the young smith whose arm had healed straight and strong, despite the deep cut it had taken during the battle. He carried his grandfather's war hammer, now blessed by the local priest and destined to hang above the forge as a symbol of the family's service to the settlement. "Father sends word that the new plowshares are ready for distribution," he told Thorvald. "And the spear points you ordered for the militia have been completed ahead of schedule." Since the crisis, Ironhold had transformed from a peaceful settlement to a well-defended stronghold. Every able-bodied man now trained with weapons. Every family knew the signals for gathering in the hall, and scouts patrolled the borders regularly. It was a harder life in some ways, but also a safer one. "My thanks," Thorvald said formally, then his expression softened. "And my personal gratitude for your courage at the stone circle. Without men like you, none of us would be here to enjoy this feast." Magnus colored slightly at the praise, but accepted it with the dignity of a man who had proven himself in battle. "We did what needed doing. Nothing more, nothing less." Old Eric appeared from the hall's shadows, moving with the silent grace that had served him well as both hunter and warrior. At his belt hung a new hunting knife to replace the one broken during the fight, its handle carved with protective runes that matched those on Gunther's silver amulet. "The Jarl calls for you all," he said quietly. "He has words to speak before the feast concludes." They gathered in the great hall, where 40 faces turned toward the high table in expectant silence. Jarl Eriksson rose slowly, his weathered hand resting on the pommel of his ancestral sword, his blue eyes reflecting the wisdom of 3 decades of leadership. 3 months passed. "Evil came to our lands wearing friendly faces," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "It sought to divide us through fear, to weaken us through treachery, to make us prey to those who would steal what our fathers built." His gaze found each of the heroes who had stood at the stone circle, acknowledging their courage with a slight nod. But evil discovered something it had not counted upon, that free people will stand together when their way of life is threatened. That courage can be found in the most unexpected places. That justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find its mark. The ancient drinking horn appeared in his hands, filled with the finest mead the settlement could provide. "I drink to those who chose to stand when standing was dangerous, to those who protected the innocent when protection was needed, to those who proved that the bonds between us are stronger than the forces that would divide us." He drank deeply, then passed the horn to Brandr, who drank and passed it on. When it reached Astrid, she felt the weight of tradition and transformation in its carved surface. The girl who had gathered kindling in fearful silence was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth and place in the world. As the horn completed its circuit and the feast continued, Astrid looked around the hall and saw not just masters and servants, but a community bound together by shared trials and mutual respect. The simple world of careful obedience had given way to something larger and more meaningful, a life where courage mattered more than station, and where every person had the right to stand against darkness. Outside, winter's first snow began to fall, but the hall remained warm with the light of renewed hope.